September 23, 2023. The Amistad Reservoir, on the Texas-Mexico border, approximately 150 miles west of San Antonio. A group of fishermen had launched their boat at dawn, hoping to take advantage of the unusually low water levels that the historic drought had created throughout the region. The reservoir, which normally held over 3 million acre-feet of water, had dropped to less than 30% capacity, exposing vast stretches of lakebed that had been submerged since the dam's construction in 1969. The exposed terrain revealed old roads, foundations of buildings that had been flooded when the reservoir was created, and the skeletal remains of trees that had stood for centuries before being drowned. But fisherman Carlos Mendez would discover something that morning that no one had expected to find in the cracked mud of the receding shoreline. Mendez spotted the object from approximately 200 yards away, a dark shape protruding from the dried lakebed at an angle that suggested something large had been buried and was now being slowly revealed by the retreating waters. He initially assumed it was debris from one of the old ranches that had been flooded during the reservoir's creation, perhaps farm equipment or a collapsed structure. As his boat approached the shallow water near the exposure site, Mendez cut the engine and waded the final 50 yards through ankle-deep mud that sucked at his boots with every step. The shape resolved itself as he drew closer, revealing curves and angles that were distinctly mechanical, distinctly automotive. It was a car, or rather, the rear portion of a car emerging from the earth like a mechanical fossil being excavated by geological forces beyond human control. The vehicle was encrusted with decades of sediment, its original color impossible to determine beneath the layers of mud and mineral deposits that had accumulated during its 56 years underwater. The rear window was shattered, allowing Mendez to peer into an interior that was filled with silt and debris. The seats collapsed and decomposed, the dashboard barely visible beneath the accumulation. The distinctive fastback roofline was unmistakable even in this deteriorated state. The aggressive slope from roof to trunk that had made the Ford Mustang one of the most iconic American automobiles ever produced. This was a first-generation Mustang, probably a 1967 model based on the body styling, a vehicle that had been extremely popular during the late 1960s and had become a collector's item in the decades since its production. Mendez immediately called 911, reporting the discovery of a submerged vehicle that appeared to have been in the water for an extended period. Val Verde County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene within 90 minutes, accompanied by Texas Parks and Wildlife officers who maintained jurisdiction over the reservoir's waters. The officers confirmed what Mendez had suspected. The vehicle contained human remains, skeletal fragments visible through the shattered rear window amid the sediment that filled the interior. The discovery transformed from a curious artifact of drought conditions into an active death investigation, with the crime scene perimeter extending across several hundred feet of exposed lakebed that had been underwater for more than 5 decades. The recovery operation required specialized equipment and personnel, as the vehicle was partially embedded in compacted sediment that had hardened around it during the decades of submersion. A crane was brought to the site from Del Rio, the nearest city of significant size, while forensic technicians documented every aspect of the scene before any extraction attempt. The process would take nearly 3 days, with workers carefully excavating around the vehicle to prevent damage to potential evidence, while photographers recorded the Mustang's emergence from its underwater grave. Television news crews gathered along the reservoir's edge, their cameras capturing footage that would be broadcast across Texas and eventually nationwide as the story's significance became apparent. The 1967 Ford Mustang was finally lifted from the lakebed on September 26, 2023. Its full form revealed, for the first time since it had entered the water 56 years earlier. The vehicle was a fastback model, originally finished in Acapulco blue with a black interior, though decades of submersion had stripped away most of the paint and reduced the upholstery to fragments of deteriorated foam and springs. The Texas license plates were missing, likely having corroded away or been removed before the vehicle entered the water. But the vehicle identification number, stamped into the dashboard, and the driver's side door jamb remained legible despite the corrosion, providing investigators with their first concrete lead toward identifying the car and potentially its occupant. The human remains found inside the Mustang were transported to the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office in San Antonio, one of the most advanced forensic facilities in the southwestern United States. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the chief medical examiner, took personal charge of the examination, recognizing that the case presented both significant challenges and significant opportunities. The skeletal remains had been remarkably well preserved by the anaerobic environment of the submerged vehicle, protected from the scavengers and environmental factors that would normally accelerate decomposition. Dental work, bone structure, and potentially recoverable DNA offered multiple pathways toward identification, while the condition of the remains might reveal information about how the individual had died. The VIN search produced results within 48 hours that transformed the investigation from a drowning inquiry into a probable homicide case with connections to organized crime. The 1967 Ford Mustang had been registered in October 1966 to a man named Vincent Anthony Terranova, with an address listed in Dallas, Texas. Terranova's name immediately triggered recognition among law enforcement officials familiar with Texas criminal history. He had been a prominent figure in Dallas organized crime during the 1960s, an associate of the Civello crime family who had controlled gambling, loan sharking, and vice operations throughout North Texas. Vincent Terranova had vanished without explanation in November 1967. Just weeks before the Amistad Dam was completed, and the rising waters began to flood the Rio Grande Valley. The FBI was immediately notified of the discovery, as the Terranova disappearance had been the subject of a federal investigation that remained technically open despite more than 5 decades without significant developments. Agents from the San Antonio field office traveled to Del Rio to coordinate with local authorities and review the evidence recovered from the vehicle and the surrounding site. Historical files on Terranova and the Dallas crime family were retrieved from archives, their yellowed pages and faded typewritten reports offering a window into a criminal era that had largely passed from living memory. The case had suddenly become active again, though the prospects for prosecution were virtually non-existent given the passage of time. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed that the remains were those of a male individual, approximately 5 feet 11 inches in height, between 35 and 45 years of age at the time of death. The skull showed evidence of significant trauma, specifically a large defect in the left temporal region consistent with a gunshot wound from a high-caliber weapon fired at close range. The damage pattern suggested the victim had been shot while seated in the vehicle, the trajectory indicating the shooter had been positioned outside the driver's side window. This was not an accident or suicide. Vincent Terranova had been murdered, his body left in his own car as it was driven or pushed into the waters that would soon rise to cover the evidence for more than half a century. Dental records from the FBI's archived files provided positive identification within 2 weeks of the discovery. The remains were confirmed to be those of Vincent Anthony Terranova, born March 17, 1931, in Newark, New Jersey. Reported missing from Dallas, Texas. On November 18, 1967, his wife, Rosalie Terranova, had filed the missing persons report 3 days after he failed to return from what he had described as a business trip to the border region. She had passed away in 1998 without ever learning what had happened to her husband, maintaining until her death the belief that he might somehow still be alive. Their 3 children, now in their 60s and 70s, would finally receive answers to questions that had haunted their family for 5.5 decades. The discovery of Terranova's remains prompted renewed investigation into the circumstances of his disappearance and his role within the Dallas organized crime structure during the turbulent 1960 seconds. FBI files from that era revealed a complex picture of a man who had operated in the shadows of the Civello crime family, handling sensitive assignments that required discretion and a willingness to cross boundaries that more cautious criminals avoided. Terranova had been suspected of involvement in multiple unsolved homicides, though no charges had ever been filed due to lack of evidence and the reluctance of witnesses to testify against organized crime figures. He had also been suspected of serving as a liaison between the Dallas organization and criminal enterprises in Mexico, a connection that might explain his presence near the border when he disappeared. As news of the identification spread through media outlets, historians and journalists began reconstructing the story of Vincent Terranova and his place in the criminal hierarchy of 1962, Texas. The period had been one of unprecedented upheaval for organized crime nationwide, with the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas casting a spotlight on the city's underworld connections and prompting intensified federal scrutiny. Terranova had disappeared less than 4 years after the Kennedy assassination, during a time when the FBI was aggressively investigating any potential links between organized crime and the events of November 22, 1963. Whether his death was connected to those investigations or resulted from internal criminal disputes remained unclear from the evidence available. The location where the Mustang was found added another layer of complexity to the investigation. The Amistad Dam project had been announced in 1960, with construction beginning in 1963 and completion scheduled for 1969. By November 1967, the dam was nearly finished, and officials had begun warning residents of the areas that would be flooded to relocate. The timing of Terranova's death, just months before the waters would rise to cover the murder site, suggested that his killers had deliberately chosen a location that would soon be submerged, using the federal dam project as an unwitting accomplice in concealing their crime. The planning required for such a disposal method indicated sophisticated criminal thinking and likely involvement of multiple individuals. The investigation into Terranova's murder had officially been reopened, though investigators acknowledged that prosecuting a 56-year-old homicide was virtually impossible under any realistic scenario. Anyone directly involved in the killing would be well over 90 years old if still alive, and the organizational structures that had ordered and carried out the murder had long since been dismantled. Yet, understanding what had happened to Vincent Terranova might illuminate a chapter of Texas criminal history that had remained deliberately obscured. The truth had been waiting beneath the waters of Amistad Reservoir for 5 decades, patient and preserved, until drought conditions finally exposed what powerful men had tried to hide forever. The building where Terranova had conducted much of his business in Dallas, a nondescript office on Commerce Street that had served as a front for gambling operations, had been demolished in 1982 to make way for a parking garage. The neighborhoods where he had collected tribute and enforced discipline had been transformed by urban renewal and demographic change. Their immigrant populations dispersed and their social clubs converted to different purposes. The Dallas that Vincent Terranova had known and exploited no longer existed in any meaningful sense, survived only in archival photographs and the memories of elderly residents who preferred not to discuss what they remembered. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on the Texas-Mexico border in November 1967 involves the violent internal politics of Dallas organized crime, a man who knew secrets that powerful people wanted buried, and a disappearance that remained unsolved for 56 years until drought exposed what water had concealed. The Mustang found in the dried lake bed was more than a vintage automobile. It was a time capsule of murder, preserved beneath millions of acre-feet of water, while the world above changed beyond recognition. By the end of this story, you will understand how Vincent Terranova rose from New Jersey street crime to become one of the most feared enforcers in Texas, why he became a liability to the men who had employed him, and how his final journey ended not on the open road, but beneath the rising waters of a reservoir that would keep his secret for more than half a century. Vincent Anthony Terranova was 36 years old in November 1967. A lean, hard-faced man who stood 5 feet 11 inches and weighed approximately 175 pounds of wiry muscle that belied his capacity for sudden, explosive violence. His hair was black, worn in the slicked-back style popular among Italian-American men of his generation, and his eyes were dark brown, described by those who knew him as cold and calculating, revealing nothing of his intentions until he chose to act. He favored dark suits, white shirts, and narrow ties that reflected the conservative fashion of Dallas business culture, though his occupation was anything but legitimate. The 1967 Mustang he drove, Acapulco blue with a black interior and a 289 cubic inch V8 engine, was both a status symbol and a practical tool for a man whose work required mobility and speed. Terranova had been born on March 17, 1931, in Newark, New Jersey, the third of 5 children in a family with deep connections to organized crime in the Garden State. His father, Salvatore Terranova, had worked as an enforcer for the Newark faction of the Genovese crime family, a career that ended with his murder in 1944 when Vincent was 13 years old. The killing, never officially solved, was believed to have resulted from an internal dispute over gambling territory. Young Vincent learned early that the world offered 2 choices: be the one who pulls the trigger, or be the one who takes the bullet. He chose to survive by any means necessary, a decision that would shape every aspect of his subsequent life. By age 18, Terranova had established himself as a reliable street soldier in Newark's criminal hierarchy, handling collections, intimidation, and occasional violence for older men who recognized his potential and his willingness to do what others hesitated to attempt. He served 2 years in state prison for aggravated assault in 1952, an experience that hardened rather than reformed him, teaching him the value of discretion and the importance of ensuring that witnesses never had the opportunity to testify. Upon his release, he found that his reputation had grown during his absence, and opportunities awaited that would have been beyond his reach before his incarceration. The criminal world valued men who could endure prison without breaking. In 1958, Terranova relocated to Dallas at the suggestion of associates who had connections with Joseph Savello, the boss of the Dallas crime family. The move served multiple purposes. It removed Terranova from an increasingly competitive environment in New Jersey. It provided the Dallas organization with an experienced enforcer, untainted by local history, and it positioned him to exploit the growing opportunities in Texas as the state's economy expanded. Dallas in the late 1950s was a city of tremendous wealth and equally tremendous corruption, where oil, money, and real estate development created fortunes that attracted both legitimate investors and criminal parasites seeking to feed on the prosperity. Terranova quickly proved his value to the Savello organization, handling sensitive assignments that required a combination of intelligence, discretion, and ruthless efficiency. He became known as the Accountant, an ironic nickname given his lack of formal education, which referred to his ability to settle debts both financial and personal with cold precision. When bookmakers failed to pay their tribute, Terranova visited them. When businessmen resisted extortion demands, Terranova persuaded them to reconsider. When rivals encroached on Savello territory, Terranova delivered messages that were never misunderstood. His methods were efficient and his loyalty appeared absolute, qualities that earned him increasing trust and responsibility within the organization. In 1961, Terranova married Rosalie Carbone, the daughter of a Dallas restaurant owner with his own connections to the Italian-American community that formed the social foundation of the Savello organization. Rosalie was 24 years old, beautiful and practical, understanding enough about her husband's work to ask no questions while maintaining the appearance of a respectable suburban household. Their wedding at Holy Trinity Catholic Church was attended by over 200 guests, including several men whose presence would later be noted in FBI surveillance reports. The reception at a Lake Dallas country club lasted until dawn, and the couple departed for a honeymoon in Acapulco that combined pleasure with business meetings that Terranova conducted on behalf of his employers. The Terranova household occupied a ranch-style home at 4127 Mockingbird Lane in the prestigious Highland Park suburb of Dallas. a neighborhood of manicured lawns and expensive automobiles, where criminal money mixed invisibly with the fortunes of oilmen and real estate developers. Vincent insisted on maintaining a facade of legitimacy, listing his occupation as consultant on tax returns and avoiding the flashy displays of wealth that attracted attention from law enforcement and jealousy from competitors. Rosalie managed the household with quiet efficiency, raising their 3 children. Vincent Jr., born 1962. Maria, born 1964. And Anthony, born 1966 inches, an environment of material, comfort, and emotional uncertainty. By the mid-1960s, Terranova had risen to a position of significant influence within the Dallas criminal hierarchy, serving as one of Joseph Civello's most trusted lieutenants and handling operations that the boss preferred to maintain at arm's length. These included supervision of gambling operations throughout North Texas, collection of loan sharking debts from borrowers who had fallen behind on their payments, and enforcement of territorial boundaries against incursions from rival organizations. Terranova also served as a liaison with criminal enterprises in Mexico, traveling regularly to border cities, where he coordinated the movement of contraband and conducted negotiations that his superiors preferred to keep at a distance from their Dallas operations. The assassination of President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, transformed the environment in which Terranova and his associates operated. The killing occurred in Dallas, and almost immediately, investigators began examining potential connections between Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and the city's organized crime structure. Ruby, who murdered Oswald 2 days after the assassination, was known to have relationships with figures connected to the Civello organization, including regular visits to establishments where gambling and other illegal activities occurred. While no definitive connection between the mob and the Kennedy assassination was ever established, the intense scrutiny that followed made Dallas an increasingly uncomfortable place for men in Terranova's profession. Joseph Civello himself came under renewed investigation following the Kennedy assassination, with FBI agents documenting his movements, photographing his associates, and attempting to develop informants within his organization. The pressure intensified after Civello attended the infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957, where a gathering of mob bosses from across the country was raided by state police, exposing the national scope of organized crime to public attention. Though Civello's conviction stemming from that meeting was eventually overturned on appeal, the experience made him increasingly cautious about operations that might attract federal attention. Men like Terranova, whose work required direct contact with violence and illegality, became potential liabilities. The relationship between Terranova and the Civello organization began to deteriorate during 1966 and 1967, though the specific reasons remained unclear even to investigators who studied the case decades later. Some evidence suggested that Terranova had been skimming from gambling operations he supervised, diverting funds that should have been passed up the organizational hierarchy. Other sources indicated that Terranova had attracted unwanted attention through increasingly reckless behavior, including a domestic dispute that brought police to his Highland Park home and raised questions about his judgment. Still, other theories proposed that Terranova knew too much about certain operations, possibly including connections to the Kennedy assassination investigation, and had become a threat to men more powerful than himself. In the weeks before his disappearance, Terranova exhibited behavior that suggested he sensed danger approaching, but believed he could navigate whatever challenges awaited. He transferred funds from joint accounts to locations known only to himself, presumably as insurance against uncertain outcomes. He met privately with a lawyer to update his will and establish trusts for his children's education. He purchased a .38 caliber revolver that he had not previously owned, carrying it beneath his jacket, even though Dallas heat made such concealment uncomfortable. These were the actions of a man preparing for confrontation, though whether Terranova expected to prevail or merely hoped to improve his odds could not be determined from the evidence that remained. The last confirmed sighting of Vincent Terranova alive occurred on November 15, 1963. 1967, at approximately 4:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, he was observed by FBI surveillance agents leaving the Adolphus Hotel in downtown Dallas, where he had apparently met with individuals who could not be identified from the surveillance photographs. Terranova walked to his 1967 Mustang, parked in a nearby garage, and drove away heading south on Interstate 35. The agents did not follow him, as their surveillance assignment focused on the hotel rather than on Terranova specifically. His car was spotted by a Texas Highway Patrol officer near San Antonio at approximately 8:15 p.m., traveling southwest on Highway 90 toward the border. That was the last time anyone reported seeing Vincent Terranova alive. Rosalie Terranova reported her husband missing on November 18, 1967, 3 days after his departure from Dallas. She told police that Vincent had mentioned a business trip to the border region but had not specified his destination or expected return date. Such trips were common enough that she had not been immediately concerned by his absence, though his failure to call after the first night had worried her. The Dallas Police Department took a report but conducted only minimal investigation, treating the case as a probable voluntary disappearance by a man whose criminal associations made his movements difficult to trace. The FBI monitored the situation but made no significant effort to locate Terranova, viewing his likely fate as an internal matter among criminals. Within the Civello organization, Terranova's disappearance was never officially acknowledged or explained, a silence that spoke volumes to those who understood the unwritten rules of their world. His gambling operations were quietly absorbed by other members, his collections transferred to different enforcers, his territory redistributed without apparent conflict. The seamless transition suggested that his elimination had been sanctioned at the highest levels, with arrangements made in advance for succession. Those who might have asked questions understood that such inquiries would be unwelcome and potentially fatal. Vincent Terranova had been erased from the organization as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The construction of Amistad Dam continued throughout 1967 and 1968, with the massive concrete structure spanning the Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico finally completed in late 1969. The reservoir began filling immediately, its waters gradually rising to cover hundreds of square miles of river valley that had been home to ranches, farms, and small communities for centuries. The location where Terranova's Mustang had been abandoned was submerged by early 1970, the vehicle settling into the mud of the lake bottom where it would remain undisturbed for more than 5 decades. Whatever evidence the scene might have provided was buried beneath millions of acre-feet of water, inaccessible to investigators even if anyone had thought to look there. Rosalie Terranova never remarried after her husband's disappearance, maintaining the Highland Park home until financial pressures forced its sale in 1975. She relocated with her 3 children to a modest apartment in Richardson, supporting the family through work as a legal secretary while refusing all inquiries from journalists, researchers, and law enforcement about her husband's activities or fate. When asked about Vincent, she would say only that he had been a good father who loved his children, that she missed him every day, and that she prayed for his safe return, even as the years accumulated into decades. She passed away on February 14, 1998, from complications of heart disease, never knowing what had happened to the man she had married 37 years earlier. Vincent Jr., the eldest son, pursued a career in law enforcement that seemed designed to atone for or understand his father's choices, serving 25 years with the Dallas Police Department before retiring in 2009. He never spoke publicly about his father, and was known to leave the room when colleagues discussed organized crime cases from the 1960 seconds. Maria, the daughter, became a school teacher in Austin, married twice, and raised 4 children while maintaining careful distance from any discussion of her family history. Anthony, the youngest, struggled with substance abuse throughout his 20s and 30s before achieving sobriety and establishing a successful landscaping business. All 3 children were alive when their father's remains were finally discovered. Though only Maria and Anthony agreed to speak with investigators, the Dallas crime family that Vincent Terranova had served effectively ceased to exist following Joseph Civello's death from cancer on January 17, 1970. Without Civello's leadership and his relationships with the National Commission that governed organized crime activities, the Dallas organization fractured into competing factions that were eventually absorbed by more powerful criminal enterprises or dismantled by federal prosecutors. The FBI officially classified the Dallas family as inactive by 1975, though individual members continued operating in reduced capacities for years afterward. The era of traditional Italian-American organized crime dominance in Texas had ended, replaced by new criminal structures that operated according to different rules and different loyalties. The forensic examination of Terranova's remains continued through the autumn of 2023, revealing additional details about his final moments that helped investigators reconstruct what had likely occurred on that November day 56 years earlier. The gunshot wound to his skull was consistent with a large-caliber handgun, probably a .45 caliber weapon based on the damage pattern, fired from outside the vehicle through the driver's side window at a range of approximately 2 to 4 feet. The trajectory indicated Terranova had been facing forward when shot, suggesting he may have been stopped and speaking with someone he knew, or at least someone he did not perceive as an immediate threat until too late. Additional evidence recovered from the Mustang included a partially preserved briefcase found in the trunk, its leather exterior deteriorated, but its metal frame intact. Inside were fragments of paper currency that forensic specialists estimated had originally totaled approximately $25,000, a substantial sum in 1967 that would be equivalent to over $200,000 in 2023. The presence of the money indicated that robbery had not been the motive for Terranova's killing, or that his killers had been unaware of its presence in the trunk. Either possibility suggested a crime of organizational discipline rather than opportunistic violence. The .38 caliber revolver that Terranova had purchased in the weeks before his disappearance was recovered from the vehicle's interior, found beneath the passenger seat, where it had apparently fallen or been placed after the killing. The weapon was fully loaded and had not been fired, indicating that Terranova had either been unable to draw it in time or had not perceived the threat until the moment of his death. For a man of his experience and paranoia to be caught completely off guard suggested that his killer was someone he knew and trusted, or at least someone he had no reason to fear until the gun appeared in the window. Historical research into the circumstances surrounding Terranova's disappearance uncovered several theories that FBI investigators had developed during the late 1960s but had been unable to pursue due to lack of evidence and the death or disappearance of potential witnesses. Theory 1 suggested that Terranova was killed on orders from the Civello organization as punishment for financial disloyalty, specifically the suspected skimming from gambling operations. Theory 2 proposed that Terranova was eliminated because he knew too much about connections between Dallas organized crime and events surrounding the Kennedy assassination. Theory 3 suggested that Terranova was killed by rivals from outside the organization who sought to weaken Civello's control by eliminating one of his key enforcers. The most compelling theory, supported by fragmentary evidence from informants who had since passed away, suggested that Terranova's death was connected to his activities as a liaison with Mexican criminal organizations. His trips to the border region had allegedly involved the coordination of narcotics smuggling operations that were becoming increasingly profitable during the late 1960s. Such operations required delicate relationships with Mexican partners who operated according to different rules and expectations. If Terranova had somehow violated those relationships, or had attracted attention from Mexican authorities that threatened the entire enterprise, his elimination might have been demanded by partners whose cooperation was more valuable than any individual enforcer's services. The specific location where the Mustang was abandoned, on a ranch road that led to a crossing point used by smugglers, supported the theory of a border-related killing. The area had been known to law enforcement as a transit point for contraband moving between Mexico and Texas. Though the exact nature of the goods, whether liquor, narcotics, or other prohibited items, varied according to market conditions and enforcement priorities. Terranova's presence in that location suggested he was conducting business related to cross-border operations when he was intercepted, either by enemies who had tracked him or by associates who had been instructed to eliminate him under the guise of a routine meeting. The investigation could not establish with certainty who had ordered or carried out Terranova's murder, though several names appeared repeatedly in FBI files as persons of interest. Joseph Savello himself was the most obvious suspect, having both the motive and the authority to order the elimination of a subordinate who had become problematic. Savello died in 1970, less than 3 years after Terranova's disappearance, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to his grave. Other potential suspects included rival criminals who might have benefited from Terranova's removal, corrupt law enforcement officials who feared his knowledge of their activities, and Mexican criminal figures whose identities remained unknown to American investigators. In March 2024, the Val Verde County Sheriff's Office held a press conference announcing the formal closure of the Terranova investigation, acknowledging that, while the victim had been identified and the cause of death determined, prosecution of those responsible was impossible due to the passage of time. All known associates of the Dallas crime family from the 1,960 who might have had involvement in the murder were deceased, as were potential witnesses who might have provided testimony about the circumstances. The case would remain officially unsolved, though investigators had succeeded in answering questions that had troubled Terranova's family and organized crime historians for more than 50 years. The announcement brought closure of a sort to the surviving Terranova children, who gathered in San Antonio for a private memorial service that their mother had never been able to hold. Maria spoke briefly to reporters after the service, describing her father as a complex man who had made choices she could not defend, but who had genuinely loved his family. Anthony declined to comment, his face revealing emotions that words could not adequately express. Vincent Jr. had passed away in 2019, never knowing that his father's fate would finally be revealed 4 years after his own death. The family requested privacy and returned to their separate lives, carrying memories that had been complicated but not resolved by the discovery in the dried lake bed. The 1967 Ford Mustang, too deteriorated for restoration, but too historically significant for disposal, was transported to a Texas Rangers Museum facility where it would be preserved as an artifact of the state's criminal history. The vehicle's journey from Ford assembly plant to Dallas streets to watery grave to museum display represented a uniquely American story of ambition, violence, and the persistence of truth across decades of concealment. Visitors would eventually be able to view the Mustang and learn about the man who had driven it, a cautionary tale about the ultimate fate of those who choose to live by violence in a world where water rises, droughts come, and secrets eventually surface. The Amistad Reservoir returned to normal levels following winter rains in early 2024, the waters rising to cover once again the site where Terranova's Mustang had rested for 56 years. The ranch roads and old foundations that the drought had exposed disappeared beneath the surface, waiting for the next extreme drought to reveal them again. The landscape held other secrets that might never be discovered, other vehicles and other victims whose fates remained unknown to families who had stopped hoping for answers decades ago. The border region between Texas and Mexico had always been a place where people disappeared, where violence was common and concealment was easy, where the land itself seemed to conspire with those who sought to hide their crimes. The discovery of Vincent Terranova's remains prompted renewed interest in other unsolved disappearances from the same era, with researchers examining cold case files and historical records for patterns that might suggest additional victims hidden beneath Texas waters. The state's numerous reservoirs, created during the massive dam building programs of the mid-20th century, had flooded thousands of square miles of land where previous activities had occurred. Some of those activities had undoubtedly been criminal, and some of the people who had operated in those areas had undoubtedly met violent ends. The drought that exposed Terranova might expose others if water levels continued to fall. The story of Vincent Terranova serves as a reminder that the crimes of the past are never truly buried, only hidden until circumstances conspire to reveal them. The men who killed him believed they had found the perfect disposal method, using a federal dam project to submerge their crime beneath millions of acre-feet of water. For 56 years, Their confidence appeared justified. But drought came, water receded, and a fisherman noticed something unusual in the exposed lakebed. The secret that powerful men had worked to conceal was finally exposed to the Texas sun, and the questions that had haunted a family for more than 5 decades were finally answered. The climate patterns that exposed Terra Nova's Mustang were themselves part of a larger story of environmental change affecting Texas and the American Southwest. Record-breaking droughts had become increasingly common, driven by climate shifts that were altering the landscape in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. Reservoirs, built to provide water security for growing populations, were failing to maintain their expected levels, exposing not just criminal evidence but the foundations of communities that had been flooded decades earlier. The past was literally resurfacing as the present struggled to maintain the infrastructure that had buried it. For the law enforcement officers who had worked the original investigation in 1967, the discovery came too late for professional satisfaction. The FBI agents who had surveilled Terra Nova, photographed his meetings, and speculated about his fate had long since retired and passed away. The Dallas detectives, who had taken Rosalie Terra Nova's missing persons report and filed it away as unsolvable, had followed their subjects into history. Only the files remained, yellowed pages in boxes that had been moved from office to warehouse to archive over the decades, waiting for someone to connect them to bones found in a dried lakebed, hundreds of miles away. 56 years is a long time for truth to remain submerged. Children were born, grew old, and died during the decades that Vincent Terra Nova lay beneath the waters of Amistad Reservoir. The Vietnam War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The internet transformed human communication. The Dallas skyline grew unrecognizable. Through all of it, Terra Nova remained in his Mustang, preserved in the cold darkness of the lake bottom, waiting for the drought that would finally expose what killers had hidden and water had concealed. The discovery was not justice in any meaningful sense, coming too late to punish the guilty or comfort those who had grieved longest. But it was truth. Finally, after more than half a century of silence, the forensic anthropologist who examined Terra Nova's remains noted that the preservation had been remarkable given the length of submersion. The cold, oxygen-poor environment at the bottom of the reservoir had created conditions similar to those found in natural springs that preserved ancient human remains for thousands of years. The skeletal structure retained sufficient integrity for detailed analysis, including the measurement of old fractures that had healed during Terra Nova's lifetime, evidence of the violent encounters that had marked his criminal career. His left forearm showed signs of a break that had occurred years before his death, probably a defensive wound from an earlier confrontation that he had survived. The ballistics analysis of the fatal wound provided investigators with additional insights into the circumstances of Terra Nova's death. The large-caliber projectile had entered the left temporal region at a slightly downward angle, indicating that the shooter had been standing while Terra Nova remained seated in his vehicle. The trajectory suggested that Terra Nova had turned his head slightly toward the shooter at the moment of impact, perhaps responding to a question or a movement that caught his attention. Death would have been instantaneous, or nearly so, the massive trauma to the brain preventing any defensive response or attempt to escape. Among the items recovered from the Mustang's interior was a gold ring bearing the initials VAT that had been found near the skeletal remains of Terra Nova's right hand. The ring was a pinky ring, the style favored by Italian-American men of his generation and social position, crafted from 18-karat gold with the initials engraved in an ornate script. Maria Terra Nova, upon viewing photographs of the recovered ring, confirmed that it had belonged to her father, a gift from his wife on their 5th wedding anniversary in 1966. The ring's presence on the body confirmed the identification and added a personal dimension to the forensic evidence. The investigation also revealed details about the final hours of Terra Nova's life that had never been documented in the original missing persons case. Credit card receipts recovered from archived bank records showed that Terra Nova had purchased gasoline in San Antonio at 6:47 p.m. on November 15, 1967, approximately 90 minutes after FBI surveillance had observed him leaving Dallas. He had also purchased a meal at a roadside restaurant near Uvalde at approximately 8 p.m., paying cash in what would be his last known transaction. The timeline suggested he was traveling toward a specific destination rather than fleeing randomly. Additional research into the criminal networks operating along the Texas-Mexico border during the late 1960s revealed the complexity of the environment in which Terra Nova had operated. The region was contested territory where multiple criminal organizations competed for control of smuggling routes that had existed since the Mexican Revolution. American criminals, Mexican cartels, and corrupt officials on both sides of the border formed shifting alliances that could change overnight based on financial considerations or personal vendettas. Terra Nova's role as a liaison in this environment placed him at constant risk from partners who might decide his value had been exceeded by his liabilities. The Savello crime family's relationship with Mexican criminal organizations had been documented in FBI reports dating back to the early 1950s, when Joseph Chavello first established connections with figures in Nuevo Laredo and Ciudad Juarez. These relationships facilitated the movement of various contraband across the border, adapting to market conditions and enforcement priorities. During Prohibition, the trade had focused on alcohol. During the post-war era, the focus shifted to heroin and eventually to other narcotics as demand increased among American consumers. Terra Nova's trips to the border were part of this ongoing commerce in prohibited goods. The specific meeting that Terra Nova was allegedly traveling to attend on November 15, 1967, was never identified with certainty, though FBI informants had provided fragmentary information suggesting a scheduled conference with Mexican partners near Del Rio. The purpose of the meeting was reportedly to resolve a dispute over payment for a shipment of heroin that had been intercepted by Mexican authorities before crossing the border. If Terra Nova was blamed for the interception, whether fairly or not, his presence at the meeting might have been requested specifically so that punishment could be administered away from witnesses and American law enforcement. The location where the Mustang was found, approximately 12 miles from the nearest paved road, would have been accessible only to those with detailed knowledge of the local terrain. The ranch roads that crisscrossed the region were unmarked and often indistinguishable from cattle trails, requiring a guide or previous experience to navigate successfully. This suggested that Terra Nova had been accompanied by someone who knew the area, or had been directed to the location by someone who intended to ensure he would never leave. The isolation made it an ideal spot for violence that would go unwitnessed and unreported. The dam construction timeline provided crucial context for understanding why the killers chose this particular location for disposing of Terra Nova's vehicle. By November 1967, the Amistad Dam was approximately 85% complete, with engineers predicting that the reservoir would begin filling by mid-1968. Anyone familiar with the project would have known that the area where the Mustang was abandoned would be underwater within a year, perhaps within months. The killers had effectively enlisted the federal government as an unwitting accomplice in concealing their crime, using taxpayer-funded infrastructure to bury evidence that would otherwise have been discoverable. The passage of more than 5 decades between Terra Nova's death and the discovery of his remains meant that any prosecution was effectively impossible, a reality that investigators acknowledged with evident frustration. Texas law technically had no statute of limitations for murder, meaning that charges could theoretically be filed regardless of how much time had passed. But the practical obstacles were insurmountable. Witnesses had died, evidence had degraded, memories had faded, and the organizational structures that had ordered and executed the killing had long since ceased to exist. Justice in the conventional sense was beyond reach. The discovery nevertheless prompted renewed interest in other unsolved cases from the same era, with researchers examining FBI files and local law enforcement records for patterns that might connect other disappearances to organized crime activity. Several cases, from the late 1960s and early 1970s, bore similarities to the Terra Nova killing. Individuals with criminal connections who vanished without explanation, whose vehicles were never recovered, whose families received no closure. Some of these individuals might also rest beneath Texas waters, waiting for drought conditions to expose evidence that had been submerged for decades. Historical analysis of the Savello crime family's operations during the 1960 seconds revealed an organization under intense pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal investigation following the Kennedy assassination had disrupted normal operations and made communication between members increasingly difficult. Internal disputes over succession and territory had created factions that viewed each other with suspicion. Competition from new criminal organizations, including the emerging Dixie Mafia that operated across the southern states, threatened established revenue streams. In this environment, eliminating a potentially troublesome subordinate like Terranova might have seemed not just prudent but necessary for organizational survival. The FBI's surveillance of Terranova during the months before his disappearance had been part of a broader investigation into Dallas organized crime that never produced significant prosecutions. Agents documented his movements, photographed his meetings, and recorded his vehicle's presence at various locations. But they never developed sufficient evidence to bring charges. Their surveillance inadvertently created a historical record that would prove valuable 56 years later when investigators sought to reconstruct Terranova's final days. The irony was not lost on those who reviewed the files. The FBI had been watching Terranova closely enough to document his departure from Dallas, but not closely enough to prevent or witness his murder. The forensic reconstruction of Terranova's probable final moments drew on the physical evidence, historical context, and investigative experience accumulated over decades of studying organized crime violence. He had most likely driven to the remote location believing he was attending a meeting with trusted associates, unaware that the meeting's true purpose was his elimination. He had been approached by someone he knew, someone whose presence did not trigger his survival instincts despite his years of experience with violence. The killer had raised a weapon while Terranova was still seated in his Mustang, firing a single shot that ended his life before he could react. The disposal of the vehicle had been handled with professional efficiency that suggested prior planning and possible rehearsal. The killers had driven the Mustang to the edge of an arroyo that would channel floodwaters when the reservoir began filling, positioning it so that rising water would submerge the evidence completely. They had removed the license plates to prevent immediate identification if the vehicle was somehow discovered before submersion. They had presumably traveled away from the scene in another vehicle, leaving no witnesses and no evidence of their presence. The operation bore the hallmarks of organized crime methodology: careful planning, efficient execution, and systematic concealment. The Terranova family's reaction to the discovery combined relief at finally knowing their father's fate with renewed grief at confronting the reality of his violent death. Maria, speaking to investigators in a formal interview, described growing up in a household where her father's absence was never explained and rarely discussed. Her mother had maintained hope for years that Vincent might somehow return, even as that hope gradually transformed into resigned acceptance that he was probably dead. The confirmation of his murder, 56 years after the fact, validated her mother's worst fears while finally providing the closure that Rosalie had never received. Anthony Terranova, the youngest child who had been barely a year old when his father vanished, struggled most visibly with the discovery's emotional impact. He had grown up with no memories of his father, only photographs and his mother's carefully edited stories about a man who had loved his family but had been taken away by circumstances that were never fully explained. Learning the truth about his father's criminal career and violent death forced Anthony to reconcile the family mythology with documented reality, a process that he described as both painful and ultimately liberating. The Texas Rangers, who had assumed jurisdiction over the case due to its historical significance and cross-jurisdictional complexity, compiled a comprehensive report that would serve as the official account of Terranova's death and its investigation. The report concluded that Vincent Anthony Terranova had been murdered on or about November 15, 1967, by person or persons unknown, most likely in connection with his activities on behalf of organized crime. The perpetrators had disposed of his body by abandoning his vehicle in an area that would soon be flooded by the Amistad Reservoir. The case was closed as solved, but unprosecutable. The final chapter of Vincent Terranova's story was written on April 14, 2024. when his remains were interred in a private ceremony at Restland Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas. His children had chosen to bury him beside their mother Rosalie, reuniting in death the couple that had been separated for 56 years. A simple headstone marked both graves, bearing their names, dates, and the inscription, "Together Forever." The ceremony was attended by family members and a few curious journalists, none of whom could fully comprehend the complexity of emotions that the moment represented for those who had waited decades for this day. The drought that exposed Vincent Terranova's Mustang was neither the first nor the last to affect the Amistad Reservoir, but it achieved a significance that transcended its immediate impact on water supplies and recreational facilities. The discovery demonstrated that the landscape holds secrets that time alone cannot erase, that violence leaves traces that persist across generations, and that truth has a stubborn tendency to surface when circumstances permit. The men who killed Terranova believed they had found the perfect hiding place for their crime. The climate proved them wrong. Rest in peace, Vincent Terranova. Your long submersion in darkness is finally over. After 56 years beneath the waters that were meant to hide you forever, you have been brought back into the Texas sun. The Mustang that carried you to your death has become a museum piece, a relic of an era when men like you lived and died by rules that seem almost incomprehensible today. Your wife went to her grave not knowing what happened to you, but your children finally have answers to questions that shadowed their entire lives. The men who killed you are beyond earthly justice. But your story has been told at last, and you are finally at rest. No longer entombed in a flooded valley, but laid to rest properly, your fate known, your memory preserved in the history of a state that has always struggled with its violent past.